Welcome back to the channel. We are going to be speaking with Dr. David Cal Johnson, who is a professor of philosophy at King's College.
Right.
Nice to have you on, Mr. Johnson. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Landon. You can call me Kyle.
Yeah, I actually caught you, initially became aware of you due to your courses on the great courses during COVID, going through philosophy, all the big themes in philosophy, and I even remember some science mixed in there. So I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I believe
really
my course, The Big Questions of Philosophy, and I definitely talk a lot about science and philosophy of science and how scientific reasoning can even solve some philosophic questions. I talk a lot about that in there. Yeah.
I think you could say, depending on how you look at it, that philosophy or science is applied philosophy. Bertrand Russell had a comment that philosophy is what we don't know and science is what we do know. It's a little more, I guess, more complex than that, but different ways you can look at it.
Yeah, in my first lecture in The Big Questions, I try to go through this. I also do this in my Exploring Metaphysics course a bit, where I talk about how philosophy is the original academic discipline. It was what, if you studied anything, you studied philosophy to begin with, right? And philosophy has this bad reputation today as being about unanswerable questions, and that is not accurate at all. That what the history of philosophy shows us is that what happened over the history of philosophy was that philosophers asked very specific kinds of questions, and they found answers to most of them. It's just that the answers were so important that they ended up spawning their own disciplines. Those new disciplines got new names. And so today people don't recognize that these are offshoots of philosophy. But it's all of it. All academics and all intellectual pursuits are philosophy to a certain degree. And that is especially true with science, where philosophers like Francis Bacon, came up with ideas about how to investigate the natural world, because philosophers were all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, were very interested in the way the natural world worked and why it worked the way it did and what the regularities were, etc. Francis Bacon, as a philosopher, develops methods for trying to discover that. And those become so important and influential that it ends up it influences Newton, it influences Copernicus, it influences all these early, what we now call scientists. But then they were just called natural philosophers because they were just applying philosophy, what we learned from philosophy about how to investigate the natural world, to the natural world to discover these things. And it eventually becomes, thanks to, who was Whewell, I believe, is the first one to kind of coin the phrase or the term scientist. Interestingly, kind of supposed to be analogous to an artist. They are scientists, right? They are practicing this art. As it were, to discover the truth about the world. But it becomes known as science, but it was originally just natural philosophy. It's just applied philosophy. And so it is also, I think it's very underappreciated. I mean, scientific reasoning goes through improvements. Like Bacon's ideas were fairly basic. Over the years, there are additional methods that are added, greater understandings of how scientific reasoning works. We could talk about Whewell. We could talk about C.S. Peirce. We could talk about the invention of the double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which is only about 100 years old at this point. And we could talk about what I think today we recognize that throughout the centuries, all scientific reasoning really is inference to the best explanation. And there are a lot of different kinds of reasoning that are engaged, that one engages in when one does inference to the best explanation. And that's why I think it's such a good definition of what scientific reasoning is it's almost kind of a catch-all. There's different kinds of reasoning. There's deductive and different kinds of inductive reasoning. Analogy can be used when you're doing inference to the best explanation. Statistics can, double-blinded testing can all be used there. But that's ultimately what it is. And it turns out that inference to the best explanation is also useful for talking about and maybe even solving some philosophical problems, right? But philosophy is now seen as unanswerable questions. It's not really unanswerable questions. It might be about questions that seem unanswerable to us today, but a lot of questions in the past seem unanswerable to people, and it turns out we have answers to them now, right? But it's philosophy kind of deals with all the questions that we have not answered yet, right? And when we do find those answers, they'll kind of spawn off into new disciplines. I think we're kind of in the middle of that with philosophy of mind and neuroscience, that there's this great overlap between the two.
Mhm.
And eventually maybe philosophy of mind won't be philosophy of mind anymore, it'll just all be neuroscience.
And
But
it graduates to science at a certain point.
right,
Yeah.
right.
I've heard the concept, or the phrase conceptual engineering. That's what you could call philosophy. I don't remember where I heard that, but
Yeah, I
one
like
way
that.
to, yeah, I
Yeah,
forget where I heard that, but that's one way to, I guess, think about it.
yeah, because a lot of philosophy is, and this may seem to trivialize it, but it's not. It's very, very important. A lot of philosophy is about what words mean, right? So when you ask a question, is X true? Well, what do we mean by X? Because it all depends on what we mean by X, about whether it's true or not, or whatever. And we can get into debates about, what are the right uses of those terms. And that might seem, I mean, obviously with the abortion debate, what counts as a person and what you define as a person matters. Um, there's there's a lot of examples where it all comes down to how you define your terms, and right, depending on how you define them, you get different answers. But anyway,
We're kind of going to be exploring, different philosophical ideas intertwined with some science. I kind of want to start out big cosmically because one of the courses I remember specifically from you is you talked about kind of the origins of the universe, but just quickly before that, when you talk about day-to-day life, practically, um, for what I've found, when I hear what I know about like the Stoics and the to an extent Buddhist, it seems to be a lot about controlling your emotions and kind of letting go of attachments. A lot of use to that, but it seems to me they're very like one-sided. And what possibly the most important thing in life that makes it worth living is passion and attachments. So for me, it always has seemed to come back to balance for me. Using your brain and finding a balance. Because if you don't have passion and attachments, you're not really living, right? So I really love philosophers. Probably my favorite philosopher and writer from the Enlightenment, which is my, I mean, I've interviewed scholars from the Enlightenment back when I was more active on my channel. Diderot is probably my favorite because he really, kind of, Philip Bloom is one author that really explored this. Diderot really got into passion and reason and how you need both, right? Not just reason. So I've always gone back to like I don't know, I don't remember the details of Aristotle's golden mean, I
mm-hmm.
think is what it's called, but something like that. It just seems always seems to come back to balance in my
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. Like, I mean, I'm not an ethicist, so I can't speak in too much detail on this, but um, that seems like there is some wisdom in not like the Stoic wisdom of not fretting and worrying about things that you can't do anything about, right? And being able to
Right.
recognize the difference between the two, right? Um, but it's also the case, and this is true for other theories as well. This is true for utilitarianism, that it's too kind of, and maybe even Kantian deontology, too detached from, like Kantian deontology is too attached from the emotion, and like our obligation to those who are close to those who we have relationships with, right? Utilitarianism wants to say that everything, the ethics or morality of everything is just determined by how much happiness it produces and sadness, or suffering it prevents, with no regard for who you are causing to be happy or to suffer, right? And that feminist authors will often like, no, your relationship with like your family can mean that it's ethically appropriate to show favoritism towards your own son or towards your own mother or something like that, where utilitarianism would not take that into account. The relationships that you have are not taken into account at all. It's just how many people are you making happy and sad, and that's the only calculus you do. And so I think you're right that those relationships that we have matter when we're talking about ethical considerations, right? And that balance, what you were saying there, immediately reminded me of Aristotle's, the golden mean, right? That
Yeah.
most virtue is found in between the extremes of two vices.
Aristotle definitely said some crazy things, but I think he probably got some things right too. He's
Sure.
a really intelligent guy. I mean, he was in a way he wasn't like you can't call him the first scientist really. I mean, because we had the pre-Socratics and they really were the first ones to be very naturalistic in their investigations. But yeah, for a lot, I mean, he seemed to just do everything from ethics to metaphysics to biology and just all kinds of things. Getting to the origins of the universe, right? I've really gotten into this in recent years. I read a lot of Sean Carroll. His book, The Big Picture, I think is my favorite science book of all time because it really just kind of goes through everything, including, like cosmology But you talked about in your series, I forget what the episode was really, but I think you said, hey, something like the quantum foam could be eternal,
Right.
you know, and we know from Einstein, energy and matter are kind of the same thing and they're interchangeable, and maybe energy could be eternal. I've never kind of understood. I mean, I get that, but energy is often described as a property of matter, but it's also it is matter. So
Right.
that little detail confuses me a little bit, because if it's a property of matter and it is matter, like what?
Yeah. Right. So it's I'm not sure that I can answer your question here. It's because, I mean, matter and energy are interchangeable, right? That's what E equals mc squared means. Energy is a property of matter, and that energy is matter are really just two different ways of saying the same thing. So it might seem contradictory, but it's not. Um, we can say that, like, a piece of matter might be moving, and we might say that that means it has energy, right? But that doesn't mean that that piece of matter that is moving is not also convertible into energy. So in other words, if you were to do whatever you needed to do to convert that from matter into energy, that would take place, right? There wouldn't be anything that was missing or additional, or the energy that was represent the energy that EMC E equals MC squared says exists in that matter would still be there. Right. I may not be explaining it correctly, but I mean, just saying that that matter has energy, what might be an expression of how it's moving or something like that, like when you're talking about momentum or something like that. But that's different. And maybe there's even an equivocation here. There's two different kinds of energy, right? There's energy that is momentum, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's like the energy that matter is exchangeable into or whatever. And that's slightly different. So there might be an equivocation there too. But notice how much the words matter here, right? So ultimately, I think the answer might be that it's just a little bit too simplistic, just to say that matter has energy, but also is energy. Different kinds of energy. There's different kinds of things it means to say that it is and it has. But I'm not sure I'm qualified to go any deeper than that.
Sure. People, and I see this on a lot of popular shows, people will often say, what is it? It doesn't make sense before the Big Bang to say that there was time or space, or to talk about anything before the Big Bang. And since I've really studied up on this, I mean, that's only certain models of the Big Bang. The Big Bang, more generally, just means that the universe used to be very small, and we can, due to the expansion, cosmic microwave background, we can tell that it used to be very small, right? And it's expanded. It does not mean that everything started from there, although that's some models, like I think Stephen Hawking, and I think he later changed his mind about it. He was kind of working on an eternal universe, which I think most physicists believe the universe is eternal now, in some way or another. There's the classic Sean Carroll, William Lane Craig debate where Craig tried to say something about Alan Guth, who proposed inflation, and he tried to say that his model, I forget what it's called, the Lincoln model, I can't remember the name. It implied that the universe had a beginning and it could not be infinite in the past or something of that nature. And he got Alan Guth on the screen and said, "No, I think the universe is, I suspect it's eternal." But anyway, that was funny, but classic.
Okay.
But
So
yeah,
he contradicted Craig. Craig said that he said it had a beginning, and then the guy specifically
right.
said it didn't. Right. Right.
Yeah, Carol got him on the screen, and he said, yeah, he corrected him. Like, I think it's eternal. Like, no. But anyway,
Right.
that's
And then
really 10 years ago, but it's a classic.
it surprised me
But
coming from right. Well, I mean, part of the problem here too is that, like, either way you have an issue, right? So let's say that the universe. Okay, so let's say that the universe did have a beginning, and so that space and time come into existence when the Big Bang happens, right? Um, if we say that, then that means that time begins when the universe begins, right? And so that means that by definition, nothing can come before the Big Bang, right?
right.
Well, since causes must precede temporally their effects, if the Big Bang, if nothing happened before the Big Bang, then by definition, nothing could have caused it. It must have been a causeless thing. It must have been something that had no cause, right?
Right.
And so, right, there's no need for a God if it couldn't literally have a cause, right? On the other hand, if it does make sense to think about what happened before the Big Bang, right, then the universe could be eternal, because you could have this eternal nothingness before it, or you could even have infinite number of universes that existed before it, right?
I mean, like we could be spawned from a multiverse, could be a
Right, exactly.
quantum fluctuation or something from a black hole. I think Lee Smolin proposed that the universe is kind of like an evolutionary cosmic. It's like kind of like cosmic evolution, and like I think black holes kind of birth universes type of thing.
Right, yeah, because
Many possibilities. There's like the Janus-based universe where we could be like going kind of like an hourglass. Like there's a universe going the other direction from us. And there's
right,
kind of, I don't know if it's the big balance, because like Roger Penrose has the cyclical model where we go through cycles, right? Kind of like the Eastern mythological idea where there's eternal cycles, expansions, collapses, and progression. But also like I think it's called the Janus model, like the god Janus with two faces, or the big balance. I don't know if they're the same thing, but anyway, we have another universe going in the opposite direction kind of from us. And so
right,
their time, for them, time is moving forward, but they're really backwards to us. And the Big Bang is kind of just a thing in the middle. So that's
right,
another possibility.
right. And so it gets
A lot of
infinite
possibilities.
directions, right, right. Yeah, and
Right.
notice that like the multiverse could, this could happen in multiple ways, right? Like, so it could be that you have a kind of multidimensional thing where you have one universe and then black holes in that universe spawn new universes in different dimensions, and then those universes have black holes, and you have this kind of branching view, right? But it'd be this kind of branching multiverse, and that's possible. And we could just be one of the many branches, right? It's also the case that you could have the cyclical model, right, where you could have expansion and contraction, expansion, contraction.
Mm.
Recently, like for a long time, as I've taught this stuff, it looks like contraction wasn't an option, that we would just expand and go back into a complete vacuum. One of the podcasts I listened to, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, was talking about some recent information, a recent study that suggested that maybe contraction might actually still be a possibility. So if that's the case, that, that kind of oscillating universe. But we might also oscillate in the other ways, right? Like, so in other words, we might expand and everything goes back, and then we get back down to complete nothingness where everything decays and you have a complete vacuum again. And then you just have another vacuum fluctuation that happens in that great expanse of nothingness, and you get another universe that comes out of that eventually decays back down into nothing. And then you could have another one, and that could go on infinitely into the past, has been happening infinitely from the past and also into the future. So that's another possibility as well, right?
Yeah.
Again, I don't know which one is the case, right? But all of
Right.
these are possible, and none of them require a God to cause it or in any way, right?
I just see it so often. The Big Bang talked about as if it means the beginning of everything, and that's not at all
Necessarily the
the
case.
case. Yeah. It is maybe a couple of different models, but it's not necessarily what it means. And again, most physicists they believe the universe is eternal in some fashion.
Right.
But when it comes to
The other
God, you mentioned
thing, so
God.
let's say this and then we'll go on. Like, the other problem is that even if you grant that, right? Let's say that there's only one universe and the Big Bang was the beginning of it, and da 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 da, right? Like, even if you say that, right? Invoking God as the explanation for that thing is not a good explanation, right? So this is where inference to the best explanation is so handy here, right? Inference to the best explanation suggests that we should accept the explanation that is the most testable, fruitful, wide-scoping, simple, and conservative. The one that makes observable predictions, gets them right, that's fruitfulness. Scope is explanatory power. One of the things you have to have for scope is to not raise unanswerable questions. It has to be simple, it has to not interject extra entities, it has to be conservative, it has to align with what we already have good reason to believe. And the problem, and this is something that you can find in a really good paper by Ted Schick called Can God Explain Anything? Even if we think the Big Bang is the beginning, right, and it's the only universe that we get, and blah, 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 blah. Invoking God as an explanation for the singularity that caused the Big Bang is not a good explanation, because it is more complicated. It is a less good explanation than just the singularity itself, right?
People
If
try to
there's
argue against that, but I don't think that works.
No, I mean,
It's
it can't,
gods.
because like the singularity is almost as simple as anything can get, right? It is a single point governed by no laws, and governed by no laws, and it is literally like everything into a single point. It's almost by definition as simple as you can get. And if you demand a cause for that, the only thing that would be simpler than the singularity itself would be nothingness, which would be the background foam, which would be the quantum foam, right? If you say, no, I don't think the quantum foam caused that, what I think caused it is an infinite being with infinite powers that I have no idea, no one can comprehend how that works and how those powers work. That's not a better explanation. The better explanation, it would just be the singularity happened for no reason, it just happened. Saying,
Yeah,
oh,
I think you're definitely multiplying entities
yes,
unnecessarily there.
you're
You
not
know,
only multiplying entities necessarily, but you're raising unanswerable questions about, well, how does this deity work? Where did he come
yeah, you're
from?
not
How
solving
does this
anything.
work? And that makes
You're
it
just
lack scope.
transferring questions, right, to something more complex, as you said.
Exactly.
Um, but when you talk about like the Kalam, everything that begins to exist has a cause, blah blah blah, doesn't mean God, and we don't know. I think I think every one of those premises comes into question. Like quantum physics, we have things that we don't seem to have apparent causes.
Exactly.
And even when you talk about cause, that David Hume pointed this out, like we can't necessarily like prove cause or like what it is, because we just see things proceed from each other. We can't prove cause, right? So it's more of a not as much of a certain thing as it seems like it is to us.
Yeah.
Um,
Any argument that talks about cause is going to run into Hume's problem of causation, right?
right.
But even if we ignore that, we get back to the same problem is, well, whatever you're going to invoke as the cause needs to be the best explanation, and
Yeah.
invoking an infinite deity with infinite powers that we can't understand is never going to be a good explanation by definition.
We also have like conservation of momentum, which, from what I've read, kind of, because of that, motion is the natural state of things, unless you have something like friction that slows things down. So you don't need a mover to make things move. You don't need a Aristotelian prime mover or whatever for that. So yeah, cause just doesn't necessarily apply to the universe itself or at the fundamental level. We don't have causes in quantum physics. You look at the fundamental laws of physics and they're time reversible. They don't
Right.
There's not really cause there. There's just like patterns basically, right? Quantum field theory, and there's no causes there. Like necessary being, there's no such thing as far as we know. Not necessarily any necessary being. But you talk about God, right? Getting back to that, if there is a necessary thing, it could just be the universe. This again, you're just transferring things. Like, because if you say God created everything, obviously, where did God come from? It doesn't really answer anything. If you want to say God is, Carl Sagan said this on Cosmos, like, if you ask the next question, where did God come from? If you say God always existed, you could say the universe always existed.
Exactly.
You say we can't answer this, you can say the universe is not answerable. And you just, again, like you said, you're adding things to the picture that.
Yeah, right. So all the things that people say about God, that he's always there, he has no cause, he needs no explanation, da, da, da. We can just say the same things about the universe. And if they say, no, you can't, say, yeah, we can. You just said that about God, right? And the advantage that we have is but ours is simpler. Like we're just saying that about the universe. You're adding an extra entity and then saying the same things about that extra entity. If you don't need the extra entity, just say it about the universe itself. And that's the
When you think
same.
about Occam's razor, I discussed this with Richard Carrier when I interviewed him a while ago. The thing about the Occam's razor, which I didn't really get it at first, is it's not like it's because it's not a law of the universe. It's a matter of epistemic logic. You're
Yes.
adding elements, you're adding components, and that makes your theory less likely. You have to have
Yes.
more things that are true to.
That's exactly right. And that is what is the case. That's what a lot of people don't understand about inference of best explanation. So again, testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, conservatism. These are the criteria that a good explanation needs to adhere to. And the more a explanation adheres to them, the better the explanation is. Critics will say, well, you're just pulling these criteria out of a hat. These are just arbitrary criteria. I can just select different criteria and think that my explanation is better according to different criteria. But you're choosing those arbitrarily. Those criteria are not arbitrary. Those are the kinds of things that good explanations need to do by definition, right? So like you say, with simplicity, a good explanation needs to be simple because the more assumptions it makes, the more likely it is to be wrong, right? Conservatism, a good explanation needs to be conservative. Again, what is conservative? Has nothing to do with politics. Conservative just means it aligns with all the things that we already have good reason to believe are true. Well, why should a good explanation do that? Because if it doesn't, all the evidence for all the things that we already have good reason to believe will count as evidence against it. So that makes it a lot less likely for it to be true if all the evidence we already have speaks as evidence against it, right? And scope is literally explanatory power. A good explanation, by definition, needs to explain things. That's what explanations are, right? And if it does so by invoking other unexplainable things, well, by definition, that's not an explanation. And so
good explanations make good predictions. They make predictions, right?
And then good explanations should make good predictions, and that's fruitfulness, right? So these are not, these criteria for what makes good explanation are not arbitrary at all. They're what good explanations must be by definition. That's what, right? And so like this criticism, like, oh, your criteria, your bias, you're just selecting the criteria that gets you the result that you want, that gets you the atheistic results you want. No, I didn't select the criteria at all. The criteria are already there by definition of what a good explanation must be.
Yeah, and for me, get into atheism in a minute, but for me, it's not like a dogmatic thing. It's just like, this is, from the way I look at the God hypothesis, is it is a hypothesis that I don't subscribe to because it's full of problems, full of holes, and you could talk about it for days. Doesn't mean I think I know everything, but it seems to me that naturalism as science has come to the consensus, through time. It's the most likely explanation. But hey, yeah, I mean, we don't know everything. The universe is huge, and who knows what's out there. But we have to go with what we know, or else if you go by something like faith, you could just believe anything.
Yeah, right. So, appealing to faith is very epistemically problematic, because as soon as it's okay to if I grant someone, well, you can believe X by faith, whatever that is, it opens up the floodgates. Well, anybody can believe anything by faith, and I wouldn't be able to say, well, it's wrong that you believe that, or what is it? Well, if you can believe X, why can't I believe Y by faith, right? And I think it's really important to note, like science, this is a very common misconception, because this is similar to the objection that I was talking about just a while ago. A lot of people object to using scientific reasoning about these things. Well, of course you're going to come out with an atheistic explanation if you use science, because science by its very nature dismisses the supernatural out of hand. And methodological naturalism, it invokes this method called methodological naturalism that refuses to even consider the possibility that the supernatural might exist. So of course, when you use scientific reasoning, you're going to conclude that there is no God. This is not an accurate representation of what science is. Science is not a worldview. Science is not an ontology. It's not a list of the things that it thinks exists or doesn't exist. Science is a method of reasoning for discovering the truth. Again, it's inference of the best explanation, and it uses criteria about what, by definition, what good explanations should do. That's its criteria. If the supernatural were real, science could discover that. If ghosts were real, let me give a better explanation. I'll go back to ghosts. ESP. If ESP were actually real, that would be something that science could actually reveal. You could do properly conducted studies to see if the ESP power is there, do the proper controls, do all whatever. And if ESP was real, the evidence would show that it was, and we would know that ESP was real, right? And in fact, those studies have been done. It just turned out that it was negative, right? So science is like, things like ESP are not beyond the bounds of science. They are completely discoverable by science. It's just that science has instead has discovered that it doesn't exist. Same thing with ghosts. If ghosts were real, science could reveal their reality. I love to use this example. I have a whole paper on this. Like, think about Ghostbusters, the movie, right? Egon is a scientist, and he uses the scientific method to show that ghosts are real, right? Like, he hypothesizes what they're made of. He's able to collect it and study it.
In the Ghostbusters universe, ghosts are real.
Yeah, in the Ghostbusters universe, right? Like, if the world was like the Ghostbusters universe, science could reveal the reality of ghosts, right? It's just, and we've actually tried to do this, right? But it turns out that all the evidence for ghosts is crap, right? And all the stories are unreliable and blah, blah, blah. I could go on and on about this, right? But if ghosts were real, science could reveal it. The fact that we have tried and failed to reveal that reality is really good reason to think that ghosts are not real in the same way this.
It's science is it's about methodological empiricism, right? Not methodological naturalism. So it's about discovering the truth. if it can be discovered, that's what it's about, right? Trying to discover.
Right.
But you often hear like science is not cannot say anything about the supernatural. It's limited to the natural. You hear
Right.
that all the time. It's not
Right. That's
necessarily
not
true.
right. That's not true at all. Right.
Because the
Most
supernatural would
scientists
affect the natural world, right? It would be detectable in some way because people often claim it is all the time, right? So,
Yep, exactly.
anyways,
Right. Yeah, that's the thing is that they'll people will claim to have scientific evidence for things like ghosts or souls or whatever it is, and then when
when
it
they can
doesn't
get it,
pan
I think they can
out,
get it. Yeah.
right, and then
Yeah.
when it doesn't pan out, they will, and you give the scientific argument against it, they'll say, well, science can't address that. It's like you just said that it could because you tried to provide scientific evidence for it, right? Now that I've
Yeah.
shown that it doesn't work and actually prove the other way, well, now you say science is unable to touch it. No, it actually is, and that's why most scientists are naturalists, but not because science is at its nature naturalistic, not because science has any kind of naturalistic assumptions behind it. Most science are naturalists
It
because
used to be naturalist.
right, but science has disproved the supernatural over time, right?
Right.
Everything used to be supernatural: lightning, tornadoes, earthquakes. Like we all thought these things had supernatural causes. Science has disproved that over time, and so the history of science is, I mean, there's other things as well, but in the history of science, you see this long arch towards disproving supernatural explanations for things, right? Where basically we're down to, we know that everything has a natural explanation.
Time is I've long thought time is probably the aspect of the universe that fascinates me the most. And people have said it's the most personal. It kind of is, right? I've read a couple of books recently all about time. I read Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time, and I read Sean Carroll's old book called From Here to Eternity or Eternity or something like that. I think his first book. Yeah, and so you find things that we know about time that are very they don't match our experience. Like it seems like because again, in the laws of physics, the fundamental laws, there is no time and time is reversible. There's no like cause or time or anything like that. It seems to be that it's the result of entropy because it's natural for things to become disordered. So over time, that's what kind of causes our experience of time and it has to do with heat. And I believe I read in Rovelli's book that it all seems to come back to heat, and heat is the kind of thing that is tied to time. So, and also we have different theories, like we have the block universe, and says that past, present, and future all kind of exist at the same simultaneously, and we only experience it one moment. I think that's kind of the most accepted.
Yeah, that's Einsteinian. That kind of falls out of relativity. The block universe kind of falls out of relativity.
It's relativity. We don't have a universal present. We know that things are relative. We take that into account, like when we in the GPS with gravity and how time moves faster because it's lighter gravity, and so you kind of have to align the clocks to account for that with our GPS. But anyway, so yeah, we don't have a universal present. Things are kind of relative that way, depending on your speed and your mass and all of that. And back to the theories, we have the one where only the present exists, right, and the past and future don't yet.
Present, right?
Right, presentism, yeah. And I think A and B theory of time kind of are the same thing. I think B theory is kind of the block universe. It's more
both A and B theories are basically a version of the block theory. So they're not. So there's the block theory, which is also called omnitemporalism, the view that all times exist, past, present, and future. Okay. Then there's something called growing block, which suggests that just the present and the past exist, but the future does not yet exist, right? And it just like the block grows, like as moments occur, the block gets larger and larger and larger, right? And so there's always just kind of more past, but the future never exists. It only exists when it's the present, and then it immediately becomes the past. That's called growing block. That does not align with
what you subscribe to.
Say again?
Do you subscribe to the block theory? Is that what you think is?
Yeah, that's the theory I think is right? Because growing block, there's a really good paper by, is it Merrick's? It's just literally called Goodbye Growing Block. And
you froze up. Did you say you think the growing block is most probable?
No, the block theory is what omnitemporalism is the one I think is most likely. Block theory, growing block theory is interesting, but I think it's got too many problems for it to be tenable. If you reject one assumption in relativity, you could make growing block work, even though you'd have to grant a lot of unintuitive assumptions that follow from it. if there is a privileged reference frame in relativity. Now, relativity says there is no privileged reference frame. All reference frames are equal. But if you have a privileged reference frame, that would be the reference frame that defines what is the present. Like that would be the objective present, and all other views of what is the present would be subjective. They would be inaccurate. And you might potentially be able to do this by saying that the reference frame that has the microwave background radiation has the age of the microwave background radiation the same in all directions. If the microwave background radiation is the same age in all directions, if you call that your preference reference frame, that would define what the present is, and then you would have growing block. Again, there are other problems that might fall out of that, and that's not what relativity says. Relativity says there is no preference reference frame. But what am I basically, if you want growing block, this is what you have to do. You have to say there's a preference reference frame, and you could do that by doing what I said, which is saying that the microwave background radiation, choosing the frame that's where it's the same and uniform in all directions. So there's omnitemporalism, it all exists. There's the growing block, which you have to reject certain parts of relativity to adhere to. And then there's presentism, which says that only the present exists, which I think is the most problematic one of them all. Yeah, those are basically the three views of time. The A and B theory of time are both the omnitemporalism. There are two different ways of viewing that. I forget which one is which. I believe the A theory, I always forget which one is A and which one is B. I believe it's the A theory basically says that there is no fact about what moment is present. The whole block just exists. And the only facts there are facts about, how far within the timeline different moments are from others.
B theory is what lined up with the block universe. Maybe I got that backwards.
I may be misremembering. So maybe it's the B theory that says that. The A theory then says, the other theory, whichever one it is, says that there are facts in the block about how far the moments in time are from one another, but then there are also facts about what is present and what is past and what is future. And so for that theory, it all already exists. It's all already there. But it's like I always make it like a old school movie reel, right? When you shoot a movie and it's literally on film, the film is all already there, but you shine a light through one of them and you're seeing that one, but all of it all exists and you just see one at a time, right? That theory of time is that it's all already there. The block all already exists, but there's this flashlight and it's shining a moment in the present, and that's the one that is occurring right now, even though all the other ones all exist. But that's the one that's occurring. Then, of course, as soon as it occurs, it no longer is occurring, and the next one is occurring.
You'll hear people say like time doesn't really exist, but I think we can't really say that. I think we don't know everything about time. But I do think what we do know, based on everything we know, is time is very different than how it appears to us. Like we're this time is this moving thing or flowing thing that we're moving through. So we know that there's no universal present. We know that the fundamental laws of physics don't recognize time. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, the point is that it's very different. It appears from how we experience it. But I don't think we know everything about it. We don't know if time started, for us in our universe with the Big Bang.
Who say that time is not real, what they probably mean is time is just a measure of change or something like that. That does. I mean, maybe, although there's a really good thought experiment to suggest that is not the case. I don't even know if a lot turns on that, right? And it's also hard to rectify with relativity, right? We know that time dilation is a thing. We know that mass affects how fast acceleration affects it as well, right? It's really hard to suggest that time is merely a measure of change in light of those things. Maybe you can make it work, but I don't know what comes out of it. Like if you say that time is just a measure of change.
Why haven't we seen time travelers visiting the past, right? I kind of think there's potentially different reasons for that, but like if it's possible. But one is like maybe when you, in the act of going to the past, you're actually creating a branching universe that you've gone to a different universe.
Yeah.
Maybe effectively created kind of a la the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics.
It's when it comes to time travel, I have whole articles on this as well. There's really only two ways that time travel could work. One is if you travel to the past, you cannot change. This is the David Lewisian view. If you travel to the past, you cannot change it. you will find that whatever happened before will happen again. And it was already, whatever you will do while you're in the past, it was already true that you were going to do that. In fact, it was already a fact of the past that you were there doing it.
12 Monkeys, right?
Say again?
Like the movie 12 Monkeys, if you've seen that.
Yes, 12 Monkeys is that way. Interstellar is that way. Trying to think of some others that are that way.
You see all over the place in sci-fi.
The recent Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny movie is that way, right? But B, most likely, if time travel is possible, it's not really time travel, it's universe creation, right? Like you're suggesting, you don't really travel into your own past. You create an alternate universe that has a past just like yours up to the moment to which you traveled, and then it's different from there on out. But right, like that would, right? But it also could be that we haven't seen time travelers because it's not technologically possible, right? Like it's not something that will ever actually be, that actually exists in the universe for human beings, right? Maybe electrons, right? Subatomic particles might be able to have a causal effect into the past, maybe even travel into the past, that kind of stuff. But it's a human body would not be able to survive that kind of.
Although, depending on how you look at it, you could say that we're all time travelers moving into the future.
That's another way. Yeah.
And definitely with relativity, there could be a type of time travel, because if you could come back after going at high speeds to where you left from, you could, yeah. Time
travel into the future is. At least the appearance of time travel into the future is at least entirely possible because of the old, you take a space, you travel out at near light speed and you turn around and come back, and you would find that less time had passed for you than had passed for the planet that you returned to. Like that's all within relativity. That is all possible. And like you said, with satellites and stuff, they experience time dilation, so they're traveling through time at a different rate than we are. So in that way, time travel is possible, but not the kind that you see in sci-fi, unfortunately. Have you listened to my sci-fi course? I have another course on great courses on science fiction.
I'm not sure if I have or not.
So there's a little plug. I have another course.
The one I remember is the one on philosophy. That's
Gotcha. Well, the one on sci-fi is on philosophy. It's called Sci-Fi Science Fiction as Philosophy. It treats movies and television shows, famous ones, old ones, new ones, as pieces of philosophy, and I talk about the philosophical arguments that they make and that they raise. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's also on great courses, so if you got access to that, it's on there. Anyway, go ahead.
I read a whole book on Star Trek and philosophy. That's probably my favorite franchise. I just went to Vegas for the Trek Con last year, so yeah.
I talk a lot of Star Trek in my sci-fi course.
I'm not surprised. Getting in just quickly into atheism, as far as like the big points, that would make one think that not buy the God hypothesis and think that it's a problematic hypothesis that you don't subscribe to. So you have things like the problem of evil. If you have an all good and powerful God, things don't line up. You have to invent all kinds of excuses and mental gymnastics to try to make that work. You have the multiple revelations, like different religions. We have a God allowing all this confusion. And if you think God cares about people and wants to save them, and it's the most important thing, why is there not clear? Something clear that's, we have the history of, we mentioned the history of natural answers, constantly we have basically the horse that's won every race is naturalism. And so what are you going to bet on in the future? The horse that's never won any, or the one that's won every one so far? You have the fact that it's just not needed and it's kind of an extra thing. We have alternate explanations that are much better supported. You have, divine hiddenness, which kind of doesn't make sense, especially depending on what type of God you're talking about. You have the content of religion, which include the content and like the holy books and its history, right? It looks very man-made. It looks very, the circumstances, accidents of history spread through force and all kinds of things. That was always a big thing for me. It's just once I started studying it, it was just really clear. And the logic, so many things don't make sense logically. For me, one thing is like you have a disembodied mind that just existed forever, right? Like what was it doing forever? Was it bored? Did it lack perfection, even though it was perfect and needed? So all kinds of things. Even though a lot of things in science don't make intuitive sense, we have evidence for them. And so anyway, I'll get into that more in just a second. But I just wanted to ask you if you had anything else that you would like add to that, like a major category, or did that pretty much cover it?
That's most of them, I think. I think that there's a couple of related things to point out. One is with religious diversity. So you pointed to the problem of all these different religions Why would, if there was a God, why would he allow there to be so many different religions? Wouldn't he hone it in onto one? And I think that's a perfectly good objection. I think related to that, though, is a kind of similar problem that comes out of religious diversity, religious experience, right? The Quran is supposed to have been written by Muhammad after a series of religious experiences. Paul is converted from Saul to Paul on the road to Damascus because of religious experience. And he is the first one to write about Christianity. The Gospels don't come until later, until after Paul. And he doesn't cite any eyewitnesses. He cites his own revelations that he has, right? Moses and the burning bush, on and on and on. You can talk about most, if not all, religions are grounded in religious experience, right? But that itself causes a problem because the religious experiences are leading to these religious beliefs, right? But these religious beliefs are not logically compatible. They can't all be true, right? And so what that leads us to realize is that religious belief usually leads to false belief. So even if there is one true religion, since all religions are based in and they definitely all have religious experiences, and those religious experiences tell them things that are only compatible, that are specific to that religion, and can only be true if all the other religions are false. That means that most of the time, religious experience produces false belief, right? Only occasionally in the one true religions that happen to produce true belief, but most of the time, it produces false belief, right? Well, something that produces false belief most of the time cannot justify belief, right? Even on the off chance that it happens to be true, right? So the analogy I often tell with my students is, suppose you had a friend that lied 90% of the time. So 90% of what that person says is false, only 10% of the time what they say is true. And they tell you, hey, there's a beer in the fridge. Would you believe them? No, you shouldn't. You're not justified in believing them because 90% of what the time they lie. And so there's only a 10% chance that they're telling the truth. Even if it happens to be that there is a beer in the fridge, you are not justified in believing what they say to you because 90% of the time that they lie. Well, that's religious experience. At least 90% of the time, not more. It's generating false belief. And so beliefs based in religious experience cannot be justified at all in any circumstances, even if what it happens to tell you it is true, right? And since all religions are based in religious experience, then all religious beliefs are unjustified.
Yeah, and there's a lot more you can get into, like why a book necessarily entails translation, mistranslation, interpretation. A God that made people would know this. It's very imperfect. All kinds of things you can get into there. You can talk about it for days.
So. Yeah, and so let me add one more thing, and then we'll go on. The other argument that you talk about, it looks man-made, right? That religion looks man-made. When you look at the history, it totally does, right? When you really understand, like read Karen Armstrong's book about the history of God, or when you look at the history of religion, it's very clear that it's something that we made up and then we changed over time. And then and people argue, rightly, I think, that that means that that suggests that very likely God doesn't exist, right? What critics of that argument will say is, well, that commits something called the genetic fallacy. You can't argue against an idea based on its origin, based on its genesis, on its genetics, right? You can't do that. That's a fallacy to say that, well, we made it up, therefore it must be false. That is an improper, incorrect understanding of that fallacy, all right? The genetic fallacy does not say that you can't dismiss an idea based on its origin if it has like a faulty origin, somebody just made it up or whatever. The fallacy is to dismiss the evidence for a view. So if a view's got really good evidence, you can't dismiss that evidence based on a kind of weird or faulty origin story for the belief itself. If it's got evidence, you got to judge the evidence, right? If a belief has no evidence, there is no good evidence for the claim, and you're wondering whether it's true or not, but it has no good evidence, and then you realize that it is something that somebody just made up. The fact that somebody just made it up is good reason to dismiss that belief. The prime example I always use is chupacabra. Chupacabra is basically like the Mexican Bigfoot. It's this crypto creature that some people think is called the goat sucker, and it's very common for people to believe it in Mexico and that kind of stuff, right? all the evidence for it is faulty, like all the stories and stuff are just stories and blah, 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 blah. But then when you trace the origin of the idea, where it comes from, it traces back to a particular individual who thought she saw something like the night that she was watching the movie Species. And if you look at the monster in the movie Species, it looks exactly like the chupacabra. And it becomes very evident that what she did is she confabulated a memory, conflating it with what she saw in the movies. And so once you realize that that is the origin story for where like the idea that chupacabra exists comes from, this example we know of somebody who just confabulated a memory, that is good reason to think that chupacabra doesn't exist. If we had good evidence otherwise, it wouldn't be, but we don't. And so that is like the nail in the coffin. In the same way, we have no good evidence for thinking that God exists. Realizing that it's just something that we made up is the nail in the coffin.
Moving on to free will, this is probably, if not one of the most complex topics for me personally, kind of wrapping my head around. You know, with free will, obviously, at the very least, our will is very limited compared to what we feel like how much will we have. So, like, I mean, you have the fact that we have these experiments. I forget the guy's name that did initially the experiments, the big ones where we like make decisions before we're aware of them consciously. They've done testing. Yeah. And also, I just read Sapolsky's book, Determined, and you know he makes really good points. You know about, again, because cause, we don't really know everything about cause. You know, at the deepest level, but it seems like everything we know, all of our actions are kind of determined by previous things. Like everything is, you know, so he goes like from whether it's minutes ago, years ago, or even going back to the culture you're born in, and you know, so everything about all the decisions you make, they're determined by other things, really. You know, even if you feel like you're free. What is your position on that, on free will? Because I go back to Sean Carroll, and like one of the things in his book where he gets more into philosophy at the end, he taught, and what he says is actually kind of true, because he says basically you have levels, right? And at the fundamental level, there is no free will, but on the emergent level, we can say we have free will, and it makes sense to talk like that. Okay, but it doesn't really address whether or not what people care about, that their will is free or how free. It doesn't really address, oh, we feel like it at this level, but it's not there at the fundamental level. Like, okay, but it doesn't really address it. So anyway, what do you think? Do we have free will, or how much do we have? What is your position on that?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, we don't. But there's a lot of nuance here. Everything turns on the definition. When you're asking the question, do we have free will? The first thing we have to ask is, well, what do you mean by free will? What does the phrase mean, right? Because it's all going to turn on that. If you mean a certain thing, then definitely we don't. And if you mean something else, we definitely could, right? And that's where it's Sapolsky, right, that wrote Determined? I think he may have a chapter. I haven't read his book yet, but I think I've heard a couple of interviews with him that I think he has a chapter on this, but I think he underestimates what's called compatibilism, because what compatibilism and what compatibilists would say is that, oh yeah, we agree with everything that you say in your book. It's just that we don't think that's that's what free will is. You think that we lack free will because you define it in a certain kind of way. And when you define it in that way, sure, because of all the things that you lay out in your book, we do not have free will in that sense. But we don't think that's what free will is, right?
I think Sam Harris, I remember I read his book on free will a long time ago. I think he was talking with Daniel Dennett, and they were corresponding. And he said that basically what compatibilists do is they say, like, we found Atlantis because we're looking at Venice, and we're saying Venice is like Atlantis because it has very similar, but that's not what people mean. And it's not actually the same thing.
A independent study with one of my graduating seniors, and his paper was on free will, and he brought up that exact same example with the Atlantis example, right? I use in the lectures, I'm rewriting for great courses. I'm rewriting my Exploring Metaphysics course right now and expanding it. The example I use is like the Loch Ness Monster, right? If I prove to you the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, and someone says, no, Nessie does exist. Nessie is this big fish that I found in the Loch Ness Monster. It's like, well, you can call that fish Nessie if you want to, but that's not what everyone else is talking about when they say.
So it's about definitions, right?
Right, so. Exactly, right. And so I personally think that's what's going on with compatibilism, that they have this other definition, right? So Harry Frankfurt defines free will as the ability to act in accordance with your second order wants and desires. John Martin Fisher defines free will basically as the ability to act in accordance with a rational deliberation. So as long as you're sensitive to reason and that kind of stuff, and then you have a, and you're not controlled or something like that, and you go through a rational deliberation and then you decide what to do, that's free, even if the process of that rational determination is completely physical and completely determined. Doesn't matter, Fisher says, right? As long as, actually, he's backed off that a little bit. I think you would call it backed off. His view is called semi-compatibilism, where he says that if that happens, he's willing to grant that you're not free, but you're still morally responsible for what you do. And those two concepts, freedom and moral responsibility, very much go hand in hand. But he separates them out.
Also, people get into like society. Well, if you say we don't have free will, like, what are you just gonna let murderers run free? Like, no, you still have to protect society. You still lock people up, like you would lock up tornadoes if you could. Right. So definitely, society still has a function. We're still social, interconnected social creatures that have to live together and all that.
So I actually have a line on this that is somewhat, it's kind of like Fisher's, although it came up before I read Fisher's take on this or whatever. Because that's the thing that people worry about. If there's no free will, then moral responsibility is out the window. We can't have any kind of moral evaluation and I don't think that that's right. So let me give this little nuance. All right. First of all, like you point out, we can still hold people legally responsible for their actions, right? If they're a dangerous society, we can lock them up. We would try to rehabilitate them. If we can't, we keep them locked away. We could use punishment as a deterrent to try to encourage people to live certain ways and to not do certain actions or whatever. We can do all of that even if free will is not a thing, right? That is all perfectly fine. And even if we can't, if there's morality is completely meaningless, if there's no free will, if that is the case, we can still punish and deter and do all of those kinds of things. However, what we can't do, I think, is that we can't hold people morally responsible for what they do. In other words, we can't say shame, 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 and blame people for what they did, because we realize that what they did because their brain has a certain structure, and that brain structure is ultimately outside of their control, right? It's their genetics and environment that make their brain what they do. However, even though we cannot put moral blame onto people, we can't hold them morally responsible, we can morally evaluate them. I can look at someone's character, right? Like when they do a particularly bad action, and I can look at the character they have that caused them to do that action. I can say, oh, that's a morally bad character. That action was morally wrong, and the character they have that made them do that action is a morally bad character that I would not want to have, that I wouldn't want my offspring to have, et cetera, right? We can morally, because we can still use utility, we can still use Kantian deontology, we can still use virtue ethics, we can still do all of those things to do moral evaluations of actions and of people. We can say someone is morally bad, and that's completely different than morally blaming them. And so even if libertarian free will doesn't, and libertarian free will is the kind of free will that people think that we really have, that what we do is ultimately up to us and we could have done otherwise. If that's not true, if what we do is not ultimately up to us and we can't do otherwise, right? We can't lay moral blame, but we can still morally evaluate. And that moral evaluation is what is necessary for kind of all the things that society needs morality to do.
I think it's worth pointing out too that people change. Obviously, change happens and people can change and change in beneficial ways. Because we get changed all the time. It's just a matter of like for me, when I think about it's just kind of luck, right? I happen to come across a certain thing that led me to a certain idea. I'm not responsible for happening to come across that idea. Being the type of person like that has good, strong willpower or work ethic, you not necessarily. There's so many things like your motivation, when it comes, how it comes. You can try, but even your trying and your ability to try, just you keep going back to these chains, like Sapolsky points out, which to me it's a really, I think, the best kind of layout of all this that I've read, just that causal chain, right? There's no magic that stands independently from it. So, right. But he also says,
go ahead.
He also says in determine, it's kind of a double meaning, because determine, but also determine in almost a free will sense. You're determined because there's a hopeful future that comes out of this, because things can be more realistic. And when we understand reality better, we have better leverage on our future, even though we're not all free and we can't just magically, do things independently of physics. There can still be positive change when we have accurate understandings of reality. So that's leverage, right? But also It's hopeful because we're more empathetic, right? We have
absolutely right. So it makes us more empathetic, right? So let me return to that. Let me put the same point in a different way, and then we'll turn to the empathy. That like understanding that we don't have libertarian free will actually helps us behave better. If we think that we have libertarian free will, if we want to change our behavior, what we think we need to do is just have better willpower. I just need to decide to do it, and my soul up here can just make that decision and effectuate the change. When we realize that that's not how we work, right, that we're actually determined in the way that we do, we realize, oh, what I need to do to change is not just will myself to change. I need to change my circumstance. I need to change my environment so I can change my neural configuration, right, to make it to where I don't do that kind of thing anymore, right? And so it makes us much more likely to succeed in changing our behavior than if we think that we have free will and to change our behavior, we seem to will it into existence, right? And then we can also be more empathetic for others because we realize that the reason that they do what they do, the reason that they perform the immoral actions that they perform, right, it's not ultimately their fault, right? And so we can, that empathy comes from not, saying shame on you, placing that moral blame. Well, we can also realize what we need to do to help them, right, to get out of that. That's why under this view, the penal system would not be retributive, where we try to give people what they deserve for their crimes, but it would be it would all be geared towards rehabilitation, right? Where we're trying to get the person to be a better kind of person. Now, if we can't do that, we still lock them away for protection of society, but the purpose behind punishment would be completely different, and it would be much more empathetic.
I think morality, quite obviously, the foundation of it is the fact it's not out in the universe. It's not a property of the universe, right? It's a matter of when you talk about we're social animals, we're interconnected and interdependent, and that's kind of the foundation. We like when we look in the mirror, we have to like somewhat like what we see and be able to live with ourselves. And also, when we treat people badly, we might feel bad about it. We often do feel bad, most people, and they might treat us bad. So that's kind of the double kind of foundation for me in morality. And divine command obviously has tons of problems, but when you talk about it, you get back obviously to the Euthyphro dilemma. And sometimes for me, it's hard to formulate that, but it's basically, does God command things? Are things good because God commanded them, or does God command things because they're good? And if God commands things because they're good, that implies that good and bad are things that are logically anterior or independent of God. And if it's just whatever he says, well, like it doesn't mean anything. The word good doesn't mean anything, and it's arbitrary, and it's and even if you say it's like some apologists do, it's his nature. Well, it's still kind of the same thing. You're kicking the can down the road a little bit, right? It's you're saying, well, does he align his nature with goodness? Because it's kind of the same thing. So anyway, what are your thoughts about the Euthyphro dilemma?
Oh yeah, I mean, the Euthyphro dilemma is damning successful in disproving divine command theory, right? So this is how I teach ethics. That ethics is this this search for moral facts. We want to know why that which is good, right? And that which is moral. And I started off by going, well, maybe God makes it so, right? And then I raised the Euthyphro problem to show, well, that answer doesn't work, right? Because if God is still
a subject too, by the way, you could still say it's subjective because
because it's arbitrary. Like he could command anything and then it would be good or bad, right? We intuitively think that there is a standard, right? That God commands things because they're good. They're just not arbitrarily good because God commands them. And even if you try to make God the standard, that has the same kind of problem.
Option like William Lane Craig, that things are good because he commanded them. Then you get his the way he tries to justify genocide.
Right.
Because God, he's the exception, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's actually one of the ways I prove divine command theory wrong is that if the thought experiment, right? Here's the thought experiment. Are you really a divine command theorist? If God came down from the heavens like he does in Monty Python, right, out of the clouds, and you knew it was God, and he said, start bashing babies' heads against the rocks, would you do it? I know this is God, but I don't think that is right. And so, if so, you've got a standard of goodness that's independent of God's command. Would never do that. That's incorrect. The Bible says that he did. Biblical scholars will say, well, God didn't really command that, right? That the people back then were saying that God did that to justify the genocide that they wanted to commit. It's like, okay, that's fine, but that means that you're not a divine command theorist, right? The reason you think that God didn't command that is because you recognize that it is evil. If you were really a divine command theorist, you would have no reason for thinking that God didn't command that, because if he did, it's perfectly fine, right? The reason you think he didn't is because you think it's wrong, and you think it's wrong because there's a standard outside of God.
And put that is God. Did he have good reasons for his moral commands? No,
Right.
if we're going along with this, if you do, then why do you don't need God? Those reasons are there, right?
Right.
So,
and so when I teach ethics, basically I say, and so since divine command theory doesn't work to answer this problem, what is it that makes, what property do good things have that makes them good? I view ethics as this attempt to try to find the answer to that question. And so you have hedonism, and you have utilitarianism, and you have Kantian deontology, and you have virtue ethics, and you have feminist ethics, and they're all these attempts to try to find the answer to that question. And each one of them has objections, right? It gets the wrong answers in certain cases, and da da da. And so what we might end up concluding is ultimately maybe moral facts don't exist in like an ontological sense. So I like to talk about Kant's noumena and phenomena. Noumena is the world as it actually is. The phenomena is the world as it appears to us. And there are things that exist in the phenomenal world that don't really exist in the noumenal world. And so in the noumenal sense, in the world as it actually is, probably moral facts are not a thing.
But a lot of philosophers are moral realists from what last time I checked.
Yeah, a lot of them are. I am not. Unless you count the noumenal world. I think that moral facts can exist, in the phenomenal world. I think moral facts can exist in the phenomenal world, the world of appearance. And the best way to address those kind of questions about the morality of actions in the phenomenal world is to use all of the theories, not just one. And so it's kind of like science, but it's a different set of criteria, right? Instead of using testability, fruitfulness, blah, 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 you use each different moral theory: hedonism, utility, Kantianism, virtue theory, feminist ethics, fairness, concerns about justice, and you use each one of those as a criteria. And when you're wondering whether you should do something or whether something was the right or wrong thing to do, you ask what each theory would say. And if most of them would say that you should do it, well, then probably you should. And if most of them should say that, you shouldn't, then you probably shouldn't. And if it's a tie, you got to make the decision, right? But there's not an answer. But that's the best way to use ethical theories, is not as
that before, but
and go with it, but to use them all in concert.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before, but that does kind of make sense. I think a lot of, you can take the best, all of these things are kind of human inventions and human reflections, and so I don't, it's tough to say any one of them is going to have all the answers and be perfectly right because they're born of human thought.
Right.
So, but yeah, we should do with everything, take the best of stuff, and we test things against reality and, see what works and,
But notice that if morality is part of the phenomenal world, it really is kind of part of our invention. And if all these theories are part of our invention too, then the best way to navigate this thing, which is our invention, is to use all these other things that we have invented, because they all kind of track our intuitions. They fall occasionally now and again on different points or whatever, but they're all kind of pointing to our moral intuitions, and our moral intuitions align with what we usually think that it is morally right and wrong and that kind of stuff. And there's certain reasons for thinking that or whatever, but it's very useful to do it that way. To give full credit, I'm borrowing from Ted Schick again. He, in his Intro to Philosophy book, he has something called Inference to the Best Action. He has a paper on this as well called Inference to the Best Action, but he only uses 4 or 5 ethical theories. I've expanded it to like 8 or something like that. I've never published this. I just use it in class, but I have a paper I use in class where I play all of these different theories and do that.
I just think that definitely divine command is might makes right. It requires no thought, no reflection, no growth. It's just
it's just the kind of easy throwaway answer that's no good.
Yeah, it's just that's not really being moral. That's just following a command, right? How does that relate to morality?
And it doesn't lead to morality, and it's too it's very obvious that what you're doing, because we have no way of determining what God commands, right? So divine command theory is always what God says is right.
Which is always people. That's what people say God commands, because that's all we have.
Right. So what does God command?
So they say different things. Yeah. Why are there so many religions? That's why, because nobody has anything that would convince everybody, that would show, it's obviously just different people saying stuff. That's all we got. And that fits the theory that there is nothing behind it. So I was going to touch on idealism and solipsism and simulation theory. I don't think we really have time for that, but just to say briefly that we don't have really good evidence for these. Everything that we, even though like thought and our inner experiences are most thing, when you get past that, everything else kind of indicates that there is an objective world, and you know, just there's different arguments you can make, like how could we have information if it just comes from us that we couldn't otherwise have, that comes from other places, and all kinds of things. But but we don't really have time to get into that. And maybe if we have another discussion at a later point, maybe we could.
Let me give you my real quick version of it, right? Idealism is crap. Solipsism can be solved with inference of the best explanation. It's logically possible that I have the only mind, but the best explanation for your behavior is that you are minded as well. And that's the same true, of course, for everyone. And so it's very likely that there are other minds. Inference of the best explanation can solve that. Inference of the best explanation can also solve something like the dream problem. Like, am I dreaming right now? It's logically possible that I am, but the best explanation for what I'm experiencing is that I'm awake. And so you can solve the dream problem that way, right?
Yeah.
The simulation hypothesis is a little bit more difficult to solve with inference of the best explanation.
The argument there is that it'd be more likely that we're in a simulation if at some point the simulations are invented because they're easier to create. So there'd be more of them, but so by probability that way. But still, like there's the argument that it'd be extremely difficult to make a simulation to this in this detail that's this good. You know, it would take like the computing power of a universe.
Bostrom, that's originally Bostrom's argument, right? Bostrom's not saying we are in a simulation. Bostrom's original argument was just suggesting that how likely you think it is that we are in a simulation should be directly proportional to how likely it is that you think that humanity will one day invent one. If you think that we'll one day invent one, well, then there's billions of simulations, but only one world, and so probabilistically we're probably in one. If you don't, then you shouldn't, right? It should just be proportional to that, right?
Simulations would still fit within the naturalism framework because more than likely, because right. They're just simulators, right? They're still a natural world somewhere.
Well, it would take a universe-sized computer to simulate our universe. That worry is solved by Bostrom and some others by talking about, I'll call it selective rendering, that the entire universe does not need to be simulated in its whole. All that needs to be simulated is just enough for the agents in that universe to observe what they're observing. So you don't, like for my desk, you don't have to replicate it all the way down to the atomic level. You just have this basic desk before me. Only if I happen to get a microscope out or something like that and look at it, then would you need to render individual atoms or whatever, right? But that fact has led to a guy named Marcus Arvon has 2 or 3 papers on this, where he argues that the idea that we live in a particular kind of simulation called a peer-to-peer computer simulation. He's not arguing that we do live in such a simulation, but he's saying that the hypothesis that we do could serve as an explanation for a number of different scientific and philosophical problems that we have not solved yet, like the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, like the seeming incompatibility of what we've learned about our brain, but our sense of free will, about causation. Like there's all these unresolved problems in physics, in physics and in science, in physics and in philosophy. And he says, if you hypothesize that we're in a peer-to-peer simulation, it answers all of them. And so the explanatory power of that idea is quite strong, right? And so he's not saying it's true, but he's saying it's not crazy, and maybe it's worth some investigation. Like we should devote resources to trying to falsify this particular kind of simulation hypothesis. Again, look up Marcus Arvon. He's got 2 or 3 papers which are really good. I'm going to incorporate it in my final lectures in Exploring Metaphysics, which hopefully will be recorded next year. So if you're listening to this in like 2025 or whatever, go look up my metaphysics course, and hopefully I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. But
touching quickly on the brain, we know the brain is very malleable, and from like core theory, we know kind of the base, pretty much all of the particles that make up everyday life, and there's no like space, it seems like, for something like a soul and things like that. But and then we've had the idea that maybe the brain is a radio, but like a radio, when you damage it, it'll alter the effect, make it a bad signal, right? But it won't change the station from hard rock to jazz or vice versa. The brain, like you get back to Phineas Gage, with dude had a pipe in his head and it completely changed his personality and like everything about him. So your personality, we know like certain functions like facial recognition, we can kind of like match it up with the part of the brain that's responsible for that.
Sure.
All kinds of things. But anyway, getting into the argument from reason, which I heard, which I thought was sort of mildly interesting. The idea from I think C.S. Lewis made it. How do you know you're using your reason that you to conclude that evolution is true, but evolution selects for survivability, not necessarily truth. So you're using the thing to justify it that you can't really justify because like it doesn't necessarily lead to true things. But like for me, I think I thought about that and really, and a lot of people have talked about it and kind of refuted it effectively, I think. But the thing is, like, first off, it selects for truth and survivability because truth often coincides with survivability. Because like if it didn't, we wouldn't survive, especially as like thinking mobile creatures that have to move around and live. Like, you know, to an extent, to a certain extent, we have to, our beliefs have to be true, match up with the world, or we like die, right?
Right.
Even though there's some exceptions to that, but like, but also, yeah, sometimes it's not truth, and sometimes something that's false could help us survive. But obviously, our thoughts are not perfect. Our reason is not perfect. Our brains are full of fallacies, and like that's what you would expect to see, right? And that's why we have to build technology, you know, to help correct for that, and to think very deeply about stuff, and you know, develop conceptual engineering to help us get through all our fallacious thoughts. So actually things actually do pretty well match up, you know, because our reasoning is not perfect like we would expect. And there might be things we couldn't even understand because our brains are the product of evolution. Like when you, obviously we thinking about the very big, the very small, and the very fast is kind of tough. It's not intuitive. And that makes sense. We evolved to survive kind of what Richard Dawkins called middle earth, right? Surviving in the middle area. So all these things actually do kind of match up. You know, again, number one is it's not, our reason is not perfect. Obviously, it's not, but also it needs to be to an extent to survive. And so there's an overlap there.
I have written on this extensively. There is a guy named Victor Reppert that is basically the modern day kind of defender of this argument that he's tried to advance through C.S. Lewis. In a book on C.S. Lewis, this is Apologetics. It's a kind of a pro and con where Greg Basham puts someone on each side, and we went back and forth on that. And in my estimation, I demolished him. So much so that, like, without telling me, he spent like 2 or 3 years writing another article in response to the debate that we had, and publishing it in a journal. But the journal was kind enough to allow me a response. And so they said that, like, you know, he had years to write this thing. And then they showed it to me and it's like, can you have a reply back to us in a month or whatever? Like, all right, stop everything and do that. And so I wrote a 10,000 word response articulating everything that was wrong with his argument. And so if you want the details on that, you can look to that.
What's your main contention against that idea?
So, okay, it's really complicated. Let me finish. If you want the short version of what's wrong with the argument, go to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast and look for episode 936. Episode 936. I did an interview on there where I did a brief version of what's wrong with the argument. The long and short of it is this. It misunderstands basically 3 things. I'm going off my memory here. I didn't research this. I haven't looked at it for a while, but basically 3 things. One, what you were talking about how something that is so, like, the reason our reason would have been selected for would be because it was selected for because it's advantageous, but it's advantageous because it gets us to the truth, right? So that's one problem. Secondly, basically the argument just assumes that there's only 2 options. Either we have a soul that's completely separable from our brain, and that's where reason takes place, or reason doesn't exist at all. It's just all it's like limited to materialism. All that exists is the brain, and that is all. And reasoning is nothing. It doesn't even exist. There are other views besides those 2 views. And so there's epiphenomenalism. There is a property dualism. There's identity theory, and all of these can answer the question about reason and all that kind of stuff without any problem, according to the argument. So those all, like, there's a false dichotomy essentially in the argument from reason. It's either soul or it's no mind at all, and no, there's gradations in between. And then The third problem is that, like, it wants to say that, well, we shouldn't believe in evolution. We shouldn't, because we reason to it, and reason is not reliable because it was selected for by evolution. Here's the fundamental mistake. No. The reasoning that led us to believing that evolution is true is not something that evolution selected for. Evolution selected for are kind of natural reasoning abilities, right? And they were mainly selected for because they had survival, advantages, right? And a lot of them are inaccurate. In our natural, uneducated state, a human being is awful in terms of reasoning, right? This is why we have so many conspiracy theories and fallacies, and, like, we are not very good at reasoning in our natural state, right? You have to be educated in order to reason appropriately, right? And to get to the truth of the matter. And specifically, you have to use scientific reasoning to discover things like evolution being true. Scientific reasoning is not something that evolution selected for. Our ability to reason scientifically is a spandrel that emerged from our complex brains, right? But scientific reasoning is not something that was selected for by evolution. It was something that was invented by humankind, by us as a collective, right? Bacon, again, was one of the early proponents of it or whatever, but it was something that was developed over time by multiple people in different contexts and that kind of stuff. And it's something that we can use, but it's not something that evolution selected for. And so there's no kind of contradiction there. Oh, you're using the thing that that evolution selected for, but evolution selects things because they're advantageous, not because they get the truth. No, scientific reasoning, the thing that led to the belief in evolution, was not selected for, so it engages in that particular kind of fallacy. Again, that's really rough shot. That's very, very basic. Go to the podcast. Go to my papers on this. My papers are available for free. Just Google David Kyle Johnson argument from reason.
Pointing out too that we have naturalistic explanations for a lot of even the more frontierish type of stuff that we don't necessarily easily understand or have great answers for necessarily now. When we talk about something like God, it's basically just magic. It's
right.
It's, if there weren't naturalistic explanations for things, then that will be something else. And there's all kinds of things you can talk about with, like, fine tuning, for example, which don't have time to get into at this point. But that's another example that could actually be, if something is fine tuned, it could be evidence against that, supernatural or God hypothesis, the fact that we are able to, exist. And it's not something like this is impossible and it has to be magic, right? That's just another point.
I have a fallacy that I have coined, and it's really just, it's a version of another fallacy called appealing to ignorance. But I call it the mystery, therefore magic fallacy. And my students find this very, very useful. People commit this all the time, that if there's something that they don't understand, it's a mystery. To explain that mystery, they invoke their magic explanation of choice, whether it be literal magic or God or ghosts or whatever it is, right? Yeah. That is always a fallacy, even when, like, you're right that most of the time we've explained things, right? And so we should invoke magic when we have explanations. But even when we don't have explanations, invoking magic to explain what we have yet to explain or what we can't find an explanation for is always fallacious. What we should do instead is realize that there is a natural explanation. We just haven't been able to figure it out yet, right? The magic explanation will always be the less simple, less wide scoping, less conservative, non-fruitful explanation. Like, maybe not always non-fruitful, but it will always be those other three things, right?
And you go back to the horse analogy, right? Which horse is the one every race when you can think about which one to bet on in the future.
And when it comes to something that's unexplained, right, if I really have no explanation, there's two things I can bet on: a magic explanation or my ignorance. The reason I can't find an explanation is because I'm not as smart as I think I am. I'm going to bet on my own ignorance over magic explanations every time because I know I'm ignorant of a lot of things, right?
Go ahead. Right. Well, there was one last topic I wanted to get into. We don't have time for it, about Adam and Eve, and I've been kind of wanting to do a video about it, but it's trying to gather everything wrong with it. It's kind of a long project.
Oh yeah,
because you've got the misogyny of it, how it celebrates ignorance when discovering things is literally the lifeblood of all progress. God punished things that it made for being how he knew they would be, and just all kinds of things. But setting up a trap for people, blaming or holding them responsible for moral or right and wrong when they didn't know the difference yet. So yeah, all fascinating stuff. I really enjoyed the conversation. Going back to the practical side, the balance, it sounds like you agree with that. That's a key thing. in life practically is just having that balance, right?
Sure.
I have on my bookshelf, I have a photo of Socrates, his I think it's his trial or execution, that the famous painting, of Socrates. And I wrote a little note, reason and remembering the importance of continuing to think and question and investigate. But also there's like another picture I have of like this beautiful woman, and I labeled it passion, right? The
Right.
passion, the beautiful things. We need both of those things to fully successfully live, I think. So yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it, Mr. Johnson. I really appreciated you coming on today, and yeah, it's all fascinating stuff.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Landon. It was lots of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.
Foresight paradigm, fine. A foresight paradigm. Foresight paradigm, you fine. A foresight paradigm. I fight for sight.